Welcome back to K8's annual review webcast. Welcome to This is the New Industry Trends panel. I'm Paul Khoury from Wiley Rein, and I'm happy to be your moderator. And I'm joined by Robert Nichols, founding partner of Nichols Lew, who has an extremely broad practice, which is appropriate for the topics we'll be discussing, as well as Karen Thornton, who's Director of Government Procurement Law Program at GW, and they are constantly looking at industry trends. So just to tell you a little bit about what we're up to here, this is going to be a half an hour, and the purpose is to look a little bit beyond what any other section may have done, any other panel, on protests and disputes, or as you just heard on data rights, at broader issues that may cut across multiple areas, and look at sort of what that means for trends for the next year. As we were talking about the kinds of topics we could discuss, we came up with several, which we think we can cover in a half an hour, that deal with contrasts that we've seen this year. And so there are two contrasts in particular that we'll be talking about, and I'll set those up for you. So first, there's a contrast between what the Section 809 panel is doing, the panel that's supposed to streamline and improve defense acquisition, and what they're going to be recommending, particularly with respect to they want to deliver lethality to the warfighter quicker, and they want to find ways to take advantage of what they call readily available technology and services from non-traditional contractors. So the 809 panel's last report is going to deal with trying to get technology to DoD quicker. Now, on the other hand, and you've heard some mention in some of the other panels about this, the MITRE report that came out in August and focuses, and it's called Deliver Uncompromised, and it focuses on cybersecurity and supply chain security, and it offers DoD kind of a holistic, centralized vision of what it should be doing to assure that kind of security, and it identifies 15 different courses of action that need to be taken when you're acquiring technology, the same technology that the 809 panel wants to get immediately. So there's a contrast there, and we're gonna talk about that. That's one of them. The other topic area we're going to discuss has to do with the use of IDIQs in procurement. Now, a GAO report came out in May finding that 40% of all DoD obligations are acquired through IDIQs. Now, FAR 16.505 expresses a preference for multiple award IDIQs. You want to have competition. You want to have a broad industrial base. But the reality is 85% of all DoD awards under IDIQs are single award. And the biggest example this year is JEDI. So we'll be talking a little bit about that contrast as well, the contrast between how DoD is actually using and how agencies are actually using IDIQs versus what the FAR says about them, and whether anything should be done about that. And the good way to tie this all together is, I think, in addressing these different contrasts, GW has had a lot of initiatives to educate, particularly the contracts workforce, on how to deal with some of them. And so we'll end with that. I'm going to start by setting up the 809 panel versus MITRE report, and then we'll hopefully have a good discussion here. So, turning to the 809 panel. The 809 panel, in its first report, defined readily available products. And here's what they said. This encompasses existing products and services that require no vendor customization to meet DoD's needs. DoD may be just one of many potential buyers, and the products are generally marketed to non-defense entities. Sounds a lot like commercial items. But what they say is that in their third report, which is coming out in January, they're going to explore how DoD can adopt more commercial-like transactions when procuring supplies or services that are readily available. And here's sort of the model that they laid out for how they think this could happen. So say that they're wanting to buy something that is readily available, and the example they've given before is electric cars. I want to buy a Tesla or a Prius or whatever. How does the ordinary consumer go do that? They get on the internet, or they look at some other available vehicle, for example, GSA schedule or what have you, and they go out and see what's available. They don't issue a solicitation. Now they go out and they do their search and they find some minimal number of potential contractors. They've posited maybe 3, which is typical of GSA. And they can also use CPARs or PEPRs or any other information available to determine who has done this before and done it well. And then they make a selection based on price, based on delivery capability, based on whatever criteria they have, which haven't been announced in a solicitation. And they are supposed to keep sufficient documentation of this review, for example, screenshots or of whatever they looked at, in order to be able to have some documentation of what happened. There's no need for a small business set aside, and the ultimate award is simply a purchase order where the government can accept mostly commercial terms. So that's on the one hand, and we're going to see a recommendation that may not be exactly that, but is going to be that, something along those lines. Then on the other hand, you have the MITRE report, which is dealing with acquisition of technology, and it's called Deliver Uncompromised. And that name is based on a concern that the government has tolerated firms that repeatedly deliver compromised capabilities to DoD and the intelligence community. So the notion is that inter and intra-government actions and knowledge in dealing with cyber and supply chain threats are not fully coordinated or shared. There's no consensus on roles, responsibilities, accountability within DoD, within the defense industrial base, or within supply chain networks. And so the report identifies 15 different courses of action. Now, I'm not going to go through all of those, but let me just hit a couple of highlights, and then we can start our conversation. So highlight number 1, and you've heard this from some of the other panels, elevate security as a primary metric in DoD acquisitions. So it should be the 4th pillar along with cost and schedule and performance. There's also a movement away from low price. And so in fact, we're seeing some proposed rules where if you're buying IT or cyber or CETA services, you shouldn't be going LPTA. There should be a presumption you're not doing that. Some of the other courses of actions: form a whole of government national supply chain intelligence center, execute a campaign for education, awareness, and ownership risk, establish independently implemented automated assessment and continuous monitoring of defense industrial base software, advocate for litigation reform and liability protections to ensure that contractors are sharing information with each other. So all of this requires effort, requires time, requires a lot of centralization, which seems contrary to, well, let's just buy it however we can and get it to the warfighter. Let me start with you, Karen. I know you've been teaching at the JAG school recently, and I know DoD's been struggling with these issues. What's your thought of how these two very different dynamics are gonna work?
Well, absolutely. The cybersecurity threats are the #1 concern. They're taking it very, very seriously. We had a presentation from an Air Force JAG officer talking about it. And I think while that perhaps is a new trend, the constant theme that has not changed in the least is that at the heart of this, the acquisition workforce, the skills, and their role and authority. And frankly, when the acquisition workforce has been diminishing significantly over time, it is going to be a significant challenge to add an additional pillar to the to the way acquisition, the contracting officers are assessing, and there's going to have to be a cultural change to move away from a focus on price. And there's also going to have to be continuous measurement throughout the performance of these contracts to ensure security. And that is going to be a tremendous, very onerous for a smaller workforce. We also heard that they'd like to see more skills among attorneys, the JAGs. They want to see IP skills, and they're putting out job announcements for folks who have a more beyond contracting to understand how to negotiate these data right deals.
Now, all that suggests things are going to be moving slowly.
Slowly, deliberately, and with a focus on process and education, which we would agree is the principled approach to dealing with something so serious.
Yeah. So suggesting that perhaps the 809 panel's recommendations may not get implemented quite as readily as they thought. So from your perspective, Robert, do you see some trends here?
Yeah, I see this as a very complex set of competing interests and competing realities. On the one hand, the government has made clear we have to have safe cybersecurity systems. And we're going to draw up contract provisions to put into prime contracts to make sure that the prime contractors deliver safe systems and take responsibility for their entire supply chain, right? And this is necessary for both security and because the government doesn't have the resources to assure that a lot of the time. So this puts an obligation on the contractors, but at the same time, it begs the question, in the cybersecurity space, perhaps we have or will have more clarity as to what the prime contractor's role is for their supply chain with regard to cybersecurity. But I think this is part of the broader dynamic where you have a contrast of expectations around what the government expects the prime contractors to be responsible for in their supply chain or their subcontracting chain. FAR 42202 says the prime contractor is responsible for managing its subcontracts. And it doesn't say that much else about how much the prime contractor is responsible. Maybe we'll have some provisions in the cybersecurity area, but it begs the question, if you're a prime and you are essentially acting as a steward for the government funds, which is what the government's expecting these days, and the government's telling you go out and buy from commercial item vendors, but you don't really know their systems, or buy from local subcontractors in Pakistan to build an embassy, or buy from any number of subs, what is the expectation the government has for you as the prime to make sure those subs are doing everything right? And I think that this is a conversation that hasn't occurred enough. The government has heightened expectations about primes, and the prime contractors are not clear themselves a lot of the time as to what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah. So I know we had talked about some of the cases that came out this past year that sort of dealt with what is the prime obligated to do. You want to chat about some of those?
There are two cases in particular that relate to what a prime contractor is required to do to make sure that its subcontractors' costs are reasonable and compliant. In an ASBCA case, this is actually a couple years old, from 2016 in Lockheed Martin, the government denied Lockheed Martin's claim for subcontractor costs based on the idea that Lockheed had not sufficiently scrutinized the subcontractors' costs to determine whether their incurred cost submission was compliant. Lockheed pushed back and brought a claim and said nowhere in our contract is there a requirement for Lockheed to audit its subs' incurred cost submissions, and they won. The court specifically said that's right, there is no contract obligation for you to audit your subs' incurred cost submissions. Contrast that with a civilian board case from a few weeks ago involving Kellogg Brown and Root, where KBR had a subcontractor in Iraq. This subcontractor encountered security problems. They put in a $50 million claim. largely based not on actual cost documentation, but estimates in a war zone. Sometimes you deal with the best evidence that you've got. And the government refused to pay, saying, well, we don't think you did enough diligence on the reasonableness of your subs costs. And the board upheld that and did not force the government to pay. So these questions, just in the area of cost allowability, and perhaps this is where the rubber hits the road for a lot of contractors, what degree of prudence do we need to have in overseeing our contractors to make sure that we're not stuck holding the bag?
Right. No, yeah, I mean, those are two good sort of contrasting cases. Just in terms of the Lockheed case, I think what the board really went off on there was there was no contractual obligation that the government could point to, and beyond that, it's not even clear that there were any unallowable costs. It's just some things were questioned, and so I think that is going to contrast, as you've pointed out rightly, with what we're going to see in new cyber and technology contracts, where there will be contractual obligations to continuously monitor what subcontractors are doing. On the KBR case, what's interesting to me, and this may be getting a little bit away from our trends discussion, is just the practice point that KBR would have been a lot better off simply telling its subs, rather than paying them off, just saying, hey, we'll sponsor your claim to the government for any delays that were caused in this contingency environment by the government, rather than, and you go prove up whatever you can. Any event. So I think we want to turn to a different topic because we only have a limited amount of time here. So let me ask you, Robert, if you want to introduce the IDIQ topic for us.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. So in April 2017 and again in May 2018, GAO issued a report on the government-wide use of IDIQ contracts, or really indefinite contracts, whether it's IDIQ or any of the other variations. As you know, FAR 16.5 permits agencies to use these, and this has been around since the ASPR days in the early 70s. What has happened, though, is there's been a dramatic increase in the use of IDIQs over the years, and you started to talk about some of the statistics in terms of the volume of the use of IDIQs and the dollars going through IDIQs. The reason for the increased use, I think, is pretty obvious. Agencies want to speed up procurements by pre-arranging with contractors for when their needs arise. They want to have flexibility, and they want to increase their administrative burdens. But what we're seeing now is that there are such a tremendous volume of dollars in contract awards that are going to indefinite quantity contracts. In 2017, Paul, as you pointed out, DoD awarded 9,754 indefinite quantity contracts, and 85% of those were to single awards. No competition after the initial IDIQ award. So for only 15% of the IDIQs was there any competition. I don't think that is really pro-competition. While it may ease the administrative burdens on the government's part, it certainly is not fostering the competition that the government also wants. And I think the JEDI contract is probably a good example of this. And I'll just mention, under the FAR contract requirements, they're supposed to have multiple awards to the maximum extent practicable. But when 85% of the awards are supported by a DNF to give it to a sole awardee, how much are they actually complying with that?
The preference seems to have been turned on its head, and the JEDI contract is an excellent example of exactly that, because it's a $10 billion cloud contract, and Oracle protested, and what it argued was, hey, 3 out of the 5 most significant cloud contractors can't play if you're going to make this a single award and based on some of the terms that you have in there. They argued this is contrary to regulation. Regulation suggests it should be multiple award. You want a multi-vendor environment because it has many advantages. It's contrary to flexibility. It's contrary to innovation. It's contrary to a broad industrial base. and keeping pace with technology going forward. DOD said, sorry, but we just simply are not capable of managing anything other than a single award. And one of the other interesting things, and this sort of brings it back to the first point we were discussing, they said, you know what, for security purposes, we need to have just a single award rather than multiple award. And so here again, what we see is DOD seems to be trying to take the attitude that less competition, more simplicity, more speed is the way to go. And GAO, you know, applying its normal standards, said, well, you came up with a decent rationale for that. Now, I mean, one sort of other interesting aspect on these IDIQs is the threshold at DOD, which is, of course, higher than it is for civilian for when there can be a protest, is $25 million. Interestingly, the 809 panel, going back to this, is likely to suggest in its new report in January that there be a threshold under which protests will not exist at all, or not be other than agency level protests will not be permissible at all. And they're basing it on treaty obligations, and they're saying we have an obligation for procurements over 85,000 to offer some sort of protest forum. So they are actually going to suggest that all buys, whether they're task orders or not, over 85,000 be subject to jurisdiction at GAO.
For that 15% that happen to be multiple awards,
Yeah,
right?
There you go. Well, even the single awards could be protested. Mm-hmm. So, but in any event, that is probably not going to be viewed favorably by DOD. I want to turn to Karen. I know on this IDIQ issue, Steve Schooner has written articles on this, and I mean, is this an area where we really need additional guidance in the FAR? What do you think?
Well, it's interesting. So Steve wrote about the May GAO report on IDIQ use in the September 2018 Nash and Seminuk report, and his observation was that with $105 billion being spent annually through IDIQ contracts, the FAR really hasn't kept up, because we still have only FAR Part 16.505 that offers, or that has a maximum extent practicable, not a mandate, use of multiple awards, and there's no guidance to the acquisition, to contracting officers, to the acquisition workforce, beyond what we have at FAR 1.102, which is that there should be sound business judgment exercised by contracting officers. So again, I agree, the Section 809 panels and Secretary Lord's focus on speed is not jiving well with what we really need to see is an emphasis on educating our acquisition workforce. They're so stretched as it is. That's why we're seeing the IDIQ contracts used to such a great extent. But what it takes is more than training, because one doesn't learn sound business judgment through training. What is that really? I would argue that's what we are teaching our students in the first year of law school, how to reason through issues, how to communicate, how to identify risks, how to evaluate in the full context of the issues based on research. So in this context with the contracting officers, it's not only the FAR that gets them to a judgment-based decision, but the challenge when they work in such a high-pressure environment. And we have students that, in our courses who are taking courses through the business school and the law school, and they tell us that they're worried that their decisions are going to end up on the front page of the Washington Post.
One of the things that I found interesting in preparing for this panel, and I know Paul looked at this too, there was a paper written in 2002 by an LLM student. I think it was the best paper of the year coming out of that program that year. by you on the problems with IDIQ contracting and the need for more guidance and more training for government contracting officers and lawyers, really, to be able to get this right.
Right.
And here we are 16 years later. But
Prescient.
it does seem that GW's online offerings may be a very easy way to leverage expertise in this area for the workforce. Can you tell us about that?
Absolutely, yes, that's definitely what we're trying to do. We recognize that gone are the days when just a rising star within an agency or an industry office comes and earns a full degree on campus in a residence program. We have a much deeper, widespread need to create the cultural change within the workforce that's really going to be required to deal with the challenges of cybersecurity and the complex costs. But it really comes down to those fundamental principles that we have been teaching all these years at GW. And the online education platform is actually superior pedagogically to the traditional model of the professor at the front of the room and the students receiving lecture. Instead, we're focusing on active learning, and the students are engaged in writing projects throughout the semester. This is truly the best way to evaluate learning and meeting those the education goals. And
I wonder if you know, you've also got the people who are going to be able to learn and then take what they learn back to wherever. But there has to be a shift in the incentives for because you were talking about your students worried about their decisions winding up on the front page of the Washington Post.
Right.
There has to be a difference in incentives for at all levels of the government for contracting officers to be able to take risks and to be able to do things differently.
Right.
I mean, what we've heard certainly from you know, the 809 panel is there are, and I certainly see in my practice, there are a number of contracting officers out there who know how to get things done.
Yes.
And who aren't afraid to show some backbone and do something that makes sense and can get things done quickly. But there has to be a right environment for that, and I think GW is teaching that as well.
Well, I think what we're teaching is the leadership skills of research-based, logical, critical thinking that can then be transferred onto the page. Because as we know, the DNF, it's always going to come down to how clearly and carefully and well supported that written product is. And so our students are getting constant feedback from each other, and our classroom, our virtual classroom, is very diverse. It includes folks from industry, various agencies, lawyers, non-lawyers. So it's not this idea of sending a cohort of folks from your office to training, but rather we're a mixing bowl. The ideas that are being shared are broadening our students' perspectives, and they're having to shift their mindset into a more growth open mindset so that they're open to receiving feedback, and they're learning how to empathetically provide feedback. Those are the leadership skills that I think contribute to building judgment and confidence and good decision making.
This is so much different from how I had always thought about online training, right? Where you're essentially learning technical skills, being fed technical skills. This is much closer to what Vern Edwards talks about, right? You have to learn critical thinking to be able to apply judgment in the right ways, and it sounds like you've kind of really developed this program with that in mind.
Yes, absolutely. We're running out of time.
Well, we've got about 30 seconds left, so just to finish it off, Robert, you want to have any? What do we think is going to happen with IDIQs?
Well, they'll continue to be bigger, more bundling, more. I think there's going to be clarity in the minds of prime contractors that they have more responsibility than they thought they signed up for, or at least they're being held more accountable than they thought they signed up for. So I think we're going to see a lot more claims in that respect.
I think you're right. Well, with that, I want to thank our panelists, Robert and Karen, and we're now going to take a break for lunch. Hope you join us back at 1:30 for the cost, pricing, and accounting panel. Thank you.